Mr. Doran enters the room to see Mrs. Mooney standing by the window with her back towards him.
Good afternoon, ma'am. You asked that I meet with you to discuss some pressing matters. May I ask what it is, ma'am?
There is no need for me to explain anything to you, Mr. Doran. You, along with the entire boarding house, already knows.
Mr. Doran opens his mouth to speak, but closes it without speaking. Mrs. Mooney walks towards Mr. Doran with her arms crossed across her chest and stands inches away from Mr. Doran.
You will marry her. This is not up for discussion. You made that decision when you started sneaking around with my daughter.
She walks out the room, leaving Mr. Doran standing rigidly in the middle of the room with his mouth slightly agape.
What you have just heard is a personal response to an aspect of the prose, The Boarding House, taken from the Dubliners Anthology of Short Stories, written by James Joyce. This is a literature lesson prepared for grade 11 students. The topic is Literature Themes in the Boarding House. The theme for the lesson is a parent's role in children's lives. Learning outcomes. At the end of the lesson, students should be able to define the term themes from the downloaded YouTube video. What is theme in literature? Identify at least 3 themes in the prose of The Boarding House. Categorize evidence from the text to support identified themes in the prose The Boarding House. Construct at least 3 arguments to support or oppose the presented moot. Mothers have a right to arrange their daughters' marriages. As was mentioned earlier, the topic for today's lesson is literature themes in the story The Boarding House. But before we look at the themes in that particular text, it is important for us to give you an insight into what the story is all about. The story, The Boarding House, is set in an era in which it is socially unacceptable to be unmarried yet sexually involved in a relationship. The boarding house in which the story is framed is operated by the divorcee Mrs. Mooney along with her 2 children, Jack and Polly Mooney. The boarding house is also home to many clerks from the city, one of whom is Mr. Doran, a wine merchant with over 13 years of experience. Mr. Doran becomes captivated with Polly's beauty, and this leads to an affair between the two. Mrs. Mooney, along with the other members of the boarding house, know of the affair, but to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Mooney keeps quiet due to her ulterior motives. Mrs. Mooney later arranges a meeting between herself and Mr. Doran, this with the intent of having Mr. Doran marry her daughter. Mrs. Mooney is aware that Mr. Doran values his job, and based on the situation he is currently in, he would have one of 2 options. 1, for him to run away leaving his job, or 2, to marry her daughter and keep his job. Mrs. Mooney is also pretty sure that he will choose the latter.
Is a theme. People sometimes describe themes as being the message of the story, the message that the writer is trying to get across, the purpose of the story, or the moral of the story. These can all be different ways of looking at themes. You can also find themes in a variety of different places. TV shows, movies, poems, short stories, plays, and novels are all different kinds of fictional pieces that will have themes in them.
The speaker in the YouTube video described the theme as a lesson or a moral that is presented in the piece of literature. It can also be the central point or a central point that stands out. Based on the boarding house, is there a particular thing that stood out for you that you could say, all right, this could be a particular theme?
One of the really interesting things about themes is that an individual story may have 2, 3, or even 10 different themes. This is pretty typical of a good narrative, is that it will have multiple themes and sometimes overlapping themes. And another interesting thing is that people will see themes in different ways. So two people may both read Romeo and Juliet. One person may say that the theme is about young love, whereas another person may see that the theme is about love being self-destructive. Both of these people are right, even though their viewpoints are a little bit different.
Views may vary as to the lessons or the themes that are in a particular text, but it is not for us to say that's not the theme that is there. But once the individual can validate the theme with particular evidence, supporting evidence from the text, then it is only valid that that particular theme be acknowledged. And as mentioned, there are many themes, and these themes, some may be common to a variety of texts or a genre, but it all depends on what evidence stands out, what stands out most in the text.
Let's take a look at some specific examples of themes that we might see. Good versus evil is a very common theme. We particularly see that in science fiction and fantasy stories. Love, which can be portrayed in a variety of different ways, such as parent-child love, love of nature, or romantic love, we see that in many, many different stories, whether those are in movies or novels. Revenge, the power of emotion, fate and destiny, and overcoming obstacles. These are themes that we see repeated and used in a variety of different ways in lots of different stories.
It is important to note that some sources may say that a theme cannot be represented in one word. However, it can happen. It is dependent on the theme itself and the evidence that is there to suggest that this particular theme is seen within this text.
So how can you identify a theme? How do you know when there is a theme, and how do you find it? One way is to look at the characters. Characters like Elizabeth Bennet, Romeo Montague, Huckleberry Finn, and Jay Gadsby. They all have themes that have to do with them in their stories. By looking at the characters and asking, what's going on with these characters, and how are these characters interacting with others, that can lead you to identifying a theme.
Let us analyze Mrs. Moon for a minute. She's one of the main characters within the text. She's an entrepreneur, she's a divorcee, and she's a parent. As a parent, she dictates what her daughter does, and even to the point of manipulation. She's even dictating what Mr. Duran does. Based on these character traits, is there any theme that pops into mind? For us, two themes were generated or can be generated from Mrs. Mooney's character. One being parental involvement in children's lives and entrapment. And based on the earlier explanation about her dictating what Mr. Doran does as well as her daughter, that's where the entrapment comes in, as well as the fact that she's influencing what happens between Mr. Duran and the daughter in the case of marriage. Even marriage could be another theme that pops out of this character.
Also looking at conflict, like person versus self, person versus nature, person versus another, and person versus society. We can locate themes by looking at what are the different conflicts within an individual story.
What possible conflicts are evident within this text? We have identified conflicts such as the internal battle that Polly is facing, her desire to be loved, as well as the thought she has about taking her life, the decision Mr. Duran has to make based on the fact that he has a premarital affair with Polly. In analyzing these conflicts, one particular theme that can be identified is social expectation. And to elaborate on that, Mr. Duran realizes he has to marry Polly, not because he loves her, but because he wants to keep his job. He knows that if his boss finds out that he has had this affair with Polly, he would lose his job. And he thinks he has worked hard, and the fact that he values his job, he needs to do whatever it takes to keep his job. He's also bent on keeping his job based on the status that it gives him. He knows that if he should lose that job, he would have to restart somewhere else, and he may find it difficult to do so.
And also looking at setting is another way to identify theme. Looking at the time period, time of year or time of day, place, geography or topography, or even the buildings within a setting. That can help lead us to a theme. Look at these things closely and ask questions. That can help you identify what is a particular theme to this story.
Let's look at the setting of this text. This text was set in an era in which premarital affairs were unacceptable. Evidence of this was seen when the priest chastised Mr. Duran after he confessed his premarital affair. A possible theme that can be derived from the setting is immoral conduct.
One of the easiest way to find theme is to look at the problems and solutions that exist within an individual story. Look at the challenges, barriers, issues, and conflicts that characters are facing as they're moving through the plot. And then look at those possible solutions that are being applied throughout the plot. That can help you understand theme that's occurring within the story.
As mentioned, all the relevant parts of the story can be used as markers for identifying possible themes within the text. But in order to do this, one must have knowledge of what each part of the story, each story element involves.
There is no one way to teach themes in literature, and it must also be considered that the students may have some prior knowledge about themes. In order to test if the students understand what it is the guideline speaks to, based on what was presented earlier, you can have them further analyze the text, having them identify additional themes relating to the characters, the setting, and the conflict. An activity that students could explore as they examine the theme, a parent's role in their children's lives, is to have them examine the mood. Mothers have a right to arrange their daughters' marriages. With this lesson being planned for a group of grade 11 students, it is sure to bring some form of excitement as the different personalities of the students would come to the floor as they share their personal views in presenting their debates. We do hope that this video will be useful in you teaching themes to your respectful grade level students.